Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this truth bomb riff. It is my great honor and privilege to interact with the incredible journalist, David Enrich, the business investigation editor of the New York Times. And this is the third in an installment of books that David has done, I believe, since let's call it 2019, 2020. But that I think are revealing probably the intricacies of the power structure of this country in a way that few have. And today is no exception, and maybe taking what he has done in the past to the next level. But first, I want to introduce the books, and I'll put them in the description down below that David has authored over the course of the last several years, starting with Dark Towers, the Shadow Towers, right? And that was the
No,
story.
Dark Towers. You got You got it right.
Well, it's funny. I'm thinking a shadow in the back of my mind because that's really what all of your books cast a long shadow on the truth of all of the things that are undergirding the power structure of the United States. But that was a story of Deutsche Bank, but also the intersection, of course, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And I remember reading that book initially and being stunned about the intricacies of the bankruptcy and Orange County as it related to ultimately what you unveiled. But it was a murder mystery. And it was interesting how that played out. It was almost like a Tom Clancy novel. But then that led into your next prolific offering, which was Servants of the Damned, an introspection of corporate lawfare, particularly on the conservative side, that has basically weaponized the law and justice to kind of invert and pervert ultimately what we think of in terms of separation of powers and laws and protections for the American people in context to really how money operates. But that leads into your latest offering, which I want to show here, and I'll also include links below. But the book is called Murder the Truth: Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. And David, to start things off, it's just remarkable that I liken you to a modern day muckraker in a sense, but you're at the nation's paper of record. And in the context of Trump and all things fake media, I'd love to just kind of get an opening sort of salvo into the nature of power, particularly as it relates to your position in it and your purpose as a journalist.
Well, I mean, let's see. How do I answer that? My purpose as a journalist, as I've always conceived it, is to speak truth to power, and the goal of all journalists, I think, is to hold powerful people and institutions to account, and to show the world or our communities in the truest light possible, and warts and all. And I think that that's a mission that defines most journalists. I think certainly most of my colleagues at the New York Times, I think and I hope, would agree with that conception. And I think I've been a journalist my entire adult life, and as you climb up through the ranks of a profession, I think it becomes more and more incumbent upon you to kind of use the position and the reputation you've gained over the years to kind of stand up for what you believe in and to stay true to the principles of your profession. And so I think, but I don't want to make it sound like I feel like you've made me sound like more of a like a murderer or doing something more heroic than I am, which is just doing the same thing all my colleagues do every day, which is try to ferret out the truth and try to focus our reporting on exposing things that are not going the way they should be.
Well, I appreciate that. But I mean, look, the long and the short of it is we live in a very scary time, and we have for some time, quite frankly. But your work has obviously turned a lot of this stuff inside and out. But I think a lot of people have a misconception about the notion of truth, particularly in this age of saturated media and too much information and misinformation at bandwidth and all of those things that come through social media specifically. But I want to see if you can establish, and you just did briefly, but further, the notion of truth isn't some sort of ideological faith construct. Truth within the context of media and the law has a certain sort of disposition. Can you explain kind of the elements that are involved in your work to establish truth?
Well, and I'm not, hopefully this is answering your question. I mean, we as investigative reporters go to great lengths to figure out what is really happening. And that can take years sometimes. And it involves interviewing people, getting documents, but also just kind of being able to step back and really try to understand things holistically in a way that is not necessarily dominated by day-to-day news headlines. And I mean, I think that one of the things that we've seen over the past decade or so, and this is what you're alluding to, is that there's really been an assault on the truth. And there are people in positions of power who have, attained that power and tried to retain that power and tried to promote their agendas using lies and distortions and conspiracy theories, and often with great success. And, aside from that, I think most journalists find that offensive because we perceive our jobs as to ascertain the truth and to share the truth with our readers and with the public. And again, I just think that, I mean, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into about the kind of the mechanics of investigative reporting. I'm happy to, but I
Just
think
top
there's kind
line.
of a well, I mean, we just spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the truth is, and that means trying to understand things from all perspectives. But it also means not just creating like fake balance and saying that there's two sides to every story, and there are often multiple sides to every story. And I think it's really important in arriving at what the truth is for us to be keeping an open mind as we do our reporting, to try to really thoroughly and in a nuanced and sophisticated way understand the perspectives of people, even if it's the people we disagree with or who are acting in bad faith, but to arrive at, truth. Facts exist and reality exists, but truth can appear different to different people depending on their perspective. And our job as journalists is to do our best to arrive at what we believe is the truth, and as kind of neutrally as possible. That does not mean that we should pull our punches and not call people out for spreading things that are not the truth, or for lying, or for using false information, or deception to promote an agenda. It means that we should make a good faith, honest, open-minded effort to understand all sides of something, and then do our best to clearly and accurately portray our understanding of the reality to our readers. And I think that there's been some confusion, and it's probably caused in part by the media itself and by just the way we sometimes do not describe things very clearly. But I mean, I think there is a difference between us, or me sitting here trying to be open-minded and objective and neutral as we ascertain what the facts and what the reality are. And then on the one, so that's the reporting process. But then the act of publishing something or saying something or speaking about something, that does not mean that we need to be completely, even handed in how we're describing something. We come down, or should come down, on the side of the truth. And it's a question of how we arrive at that truth and understand that truth. I think that's important. And that's where objectivity comes in, is trying to figure out the truth. I think we do not need to be, I think, like, journalists have a strong bias in favor of telling the truth, and we need to be open and clear-eyed about describing that to our readers. And that's something that, is sometimes easier said than done. And sometimes it's hard to figure out what the truth is, right? Like, there are things where, there are different perspectives and competing sets of facts, and you can do your best to sort out fact from fiction. But especially if you're operating on a tight deadline, I think that is, again, it's something that is much harder than it maybe seems. One of the luxuries that I have, as an investigative journalist and working at a place like the New York Times, which has a ton of resources and like amazing colleagues and great lawyers and things like that, is that I generally have the time to spend months, if not years, like working on things and trying to really penetrate institutions and trying to get to the bottom of things. And that's a luxury and a privilege that, you know, quite a few of my colleagues at the Times have, but there are not that many journalists in the world who can say that. And I think it's one of the things that makes the New York Times really special.
Well, and to that point, though, I love the term in the context of what you were just describing, discovery. Same goes for the law. The idea of truth
Yeah.
is that when you aggregate the information and you look at it from all sides, that you can discern what the causality is in many cases. And of course, the law's remedy is to have different degrees of convictions based on the evidence and indictments if the case goes to trial and that sort of thing. But in the context of journalism, I think it would be really cool to get your sort of response based on what you just laid out in context to the importance of the First Amendment, but primarily as it related to the founders' framing of freedom of, freedom of the press.
Well, that was just a very kind of core part of their understanding of what was going to prevent America from becoming a tyrannical government or a monarchy or something like that. That it was really important to have various checks on the power, especially of the executive branch, but really of the government in general. And so you have separation of powers, for example. You have three branches, three co-equal branches of government that are all, I mean, among other things, designed to create tension and conflict. It's supposed to slow things down and hold each other in check. And you have a press that is supposed to be providing an additional, a fourth check on all three of those branches of government. And that was directly the reason the First Amendment and the freedom of the press exist in the Bill of Rights and in the First Amendment is in part because of the experience the colonists had had prior to the American Revolution with publishers and journalists of the day being censored and being persecuted. And that was something that happened in the U.S. It happened in England, and it was really core to the founders' belief in what America should be and could be. That you needed to have free speech rights for citizens and a vigorous, independent, credible media that would serve as a check on concentrated power. And that by design, that is supposed to be something that's uncomfortable and at times unpleasant for the people in power. And that's kind of the point. Like you do not want a press that it defeats the entire purpose of an independent media if the media is serving more as a lapdog or as an enabler. You want there to be tension. You want there to be some conflict. You want there to be, the roles should be a little bit antagonistic and there should be friction. And the friction is the point. In the same way, the friction is the point between the executive and legislative branch or between the judicial and executive branches. It's meant to slow things down. It's meant to constrain things. And and that's also part of the reason that politicians for 200 years now have often had very tense and fraught relationships with the fourth estate, with journalism. And again, until very recently, though, and this is obviously the trend that I'm tracking in the book, is that until fairly recently, while there has been, media bashing has been a bipartisan tradition for a long time, and that's fine among politicians, but it's only relatively recently that kind of rhetorical media bashing has become something that has really spilled over into the policy arena, and where you have some leading politicians and many others as well and really campaigning to curtail our notion of what the First Amendment is and the types of speech and language that it protects. And to me, that's and I think really clearly designed to muzzle certain types of unpopular speech, to make it easier for people like the president to intimidate, threaten, and in some cases penalize journalism that he and his allies don't like. And I finished, and I don't want to like preempt your other questions, but I mean, I finished writing the bulk of this book before the election, and obviously had to rework parts of it based on the election. But it was completely done by the end of 2024. And so it's been very interesting and startling to me to see that, I was not an optimist about this kind of stuff. And that's part of the reason I wrote this book in the first place. But my expectations have been exceeded in the past 2 months just by the swiftness and severity of how the White House is really taking on not just the media, but kind of all numerous pillars of civic society. I think that's crazy times.
Crazy times indeed. I mean, it's all part of a continuum. And yeah, we could say the timing is just incredible, but at the same time, this has been the story for some time. And again, we've got metaphors that go back literally centuries. I mean, when you consider absolute power corrupts absolutely, or one of my favorites is Bastiat, who said, when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. And I was always reminded when I heard that about, Trump and Roy Cohn in the 5 decades. I interact a lot with David K. Johnston. And so I've been very aware of Trump's involvement with all manner, shape, or form of things that could have led to convictions long ago, had it not been for what Jesse Eisinger termed the chicken shit club. But in context of what you said and the scary times that we're in, I want to read one quote that I thought really kind of, actually all the quotes, about this book. They were really incredibly tantalizing. But authoritarian governments abroad have long used legal threats and lawsuits against journalists to cover up their disinformation, corruption, and violence. Now, as master investigative journalist David Enrich reveals, those tactics have arrived in America. Murder the Truth is a timely and essential study of how these favored legal tools of repressive regimes are being regularly deployed in the United States to conceal the truth, to discredit the press, and benefit the anti democratic forces. Look, David, I learned a long time ago that some people, particularly as I kind of associate it with Trump, the formula is to lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate to cover up wrongdoings. And so when you consider the freedom of the press, the First Amendment, can you explain then how that dovetails into Sullivan versus New York Times?
Well, that case dates back. It's a really interesting story. It dates back to 1960 when the New York Times ran a full page ad that was paid for by supporters of Martin Luther King. And the ad was basically, I mean, it was a fundraising appeal, but it described in detail some of the terrible things that racist Southern officials were doing as they tried to cling to white supremacy. And, the gist of the ad was completely right. But some of the facts in it were either wrong or exaggerated. And one of the people who was kind of implicated, though not by name, in the ad, a guy named L.B. Sullivan, sued the Times, claiming that he had been defamed again, even though he wasn't named, which is a little ridiculous, but he claimed he had been defamed because of some of the inaccuracies in the ad. And the case went to trial in a racist Alabama courtroom, and the jury quickly found in favor of Sullivan and against the New York Times. And they handed down a verdict for $500,000, which at the time was it was a really devastating amount of money for the New York Times in that era. And the Times responded to that decision by pulling its reporters out of Alabama, which is where the lawsuit had taken place, and basically counseling them to avoid writing about institutional racism in the South. And so, and part of the reason they did that is there was this kind of start of a tidal wave of litigation by people like L.B. Sullivan that were really using these lawsuits, which were quite frivolous, but were seizing on kind of good faith errors that were made in the course of reporting to sue outlets like the New York Times and like the big national broadcast networks into oblivion and make it financially impossible for them to cover the civil rights movement in the South. And so the Times, aside from pulling its reporters out of Alabama, also appealed. The appeal eventually made its way up to the Supreme Court in 1964. And the court in that case issued a landmark decision, which was that if you're a public figure or a public official, in order to win a defamation case, you need to not only prove that there were falsehoods and that they damaged your reputation, but that those defamatory falsehoods whoever made those defamatory falsehoods did so either knowing that what they were saying was false, so lying, or acting with reckless disregard for the accuracy of what they were saying. And the idea in the Supreme Court articulated in that case was that in a free society where we value unfettered free speech and where we view the media as an important check on concentrated power, journalists and members of the public need to have breathing room so that if they, in their kind of discussion or debate or criticism of powerful people, if they make a good faith error, if they get a fact wrong by accident, that does not open them up to basically bottomless, endless legal liability. Because if you have that endless legal liability, it is going to send a very clear chilling effect and lead people to self-censor, which is exactly what the New York Times had started doing as a result of L.B. Sullivan's lawsuit. So it was a really high bar that public figures and public officials now had to clear. But one of the things we've seen over the intervening 60 years since that case was decided was that it's a high bar, but it is by no means an insurmountable one. And we've seen lots of successful libel actions against liberal media, conservative media, mainstream media. And in fact, one of the trends that I find troubling and that I spend a lot of time documenting in the book is that despite these kind of very robust legal protections that the Supreme Court has created, there is still a really alarming pattern of legal actions and threats being weaponized to punish journalists and members of the public who speak out against powerful people. And, I'm sitting right now in the New York Times newsroom. We are not and we face this stuff all the time. And that's like, it's not great, but it's also, we're not the real victims of this. The people who are the victims of this and are really influenced by this are independent journalists, community newspapers, someone with a Substack newsletter or a podcast or a YouTube show, or members of the public. And those are people who generally do not have the money or the lawyers or the experience or the time to spend years like dealing with litigation. And so getting a threat from a high priced lawyer on behalf of someone who you're writing about is like, A, it's really scary. And B, it creates a situation where actually the rational thing for you to do as an independent journalist is to just save yourself. And that often means letting it go, letting the matter drop, maybe watering down what you were planning to say, be really careful. And, that obviously, I mean, by design creates a very intense chilling effect, which again is not necessarily about someone covering the White House or national security matters. It might be the local newspaper writing about a big real estate developer that's trying to like pave over like a park in your area, or maybe it's about like a local restaurant owner that's poisoning people by accident. I'm just making stuff up, but this is occurring at a national level, and that generates all the headlines because we live in these crazy times. But the reality is that so much more of this is happening at a local level that's out of sight, generally out of sight of the mainstream media, and it's really kind of this quiet form of censorship that is taking place all over the country. And that's why I wrote this book, because I saw that, I started to see that happening, and I do not think it has received the attention it deserves. And it's way too easy for people on both the right and the left to say, well, we hate the media for reasons X, Y, and Z. And so is it really the worst thing if they start getting sued a lot? And the truth is, I mean, I think that's a very bad trend. But really, even if you don't think that's a bad trend, there's no question that what this is doing is it's really muzzling people at a local level. And they don't even need to be journalists to feel that chilling effect.
Yeah. Wow. What an incredibly powerful introspection and perspective. But this has also been a trend for a long time. I mean, we've
Yep.
seen hedge funds purchase local independent newspapers around the country for the past 20 years, and private equity's gotten involved, and all sorts of, shall we say, business models that don't actually seem to be, there's an appetite for investigative journalism in a way that I grew up with, for example. And so, when you talk about the sort of the top down effect coming down into the local situations, I definitely want to address that, but I want to kind of build to that scenario by maybe giving the audience a little bit of a different perspective, not so much different, but a corollary, because it occurred to me when I was reading your revelations of the tactics, and I want to get into Peter Thiel and Gawker and what that reveals as the kind of the entry point to Murder the Truth. But I think everybody can relate to this just really quick metaphor. So let's just say, for example, there's a hardworking student in, I don't know, elementary school who isn't going along the lines of a bully that's in class, whose dad happens to be somebody who gives a lot of money in the community and happen to have influence on a president or a principal. And something happens to where that kid might be the recipient of some sort of terror antics by the bullies, and then tries to actually get justice to just be able to do what is right and then to reveal what's happening to them. But the entirety of that story is suppressed because of machinations behind the scenes that that person might not be aware of. When you think of those sort of bullying tactics, can you parlay that into understanding those with resources, somebody like the billionaire tech titan Peter Thiel, in context to the story that you reveal regarding Gawker?
Yeah, I mean, it's a not a bad analogy. I mean, Peter Thiel, uh, the Silicon Valley billionaire and Trump mega donor and Elon Musk ally. This is more than a decade ago now, but there was this feisty website that a surprising number of people don't even really remember at this point, but called Gawker, whose like MO was basically to offend the sensibilities of people in positions of power. And one of their favorite uh, types of people to offend were people like Silicon Valley elites, like Peter Thiel. And so Gawker wrote all of these, and frankly, kind of obnoxious, but also very revealing stories about Peter Thiel. And they range from, identifying his sexual orientation on the one hand, to like showing kind of the inner workings of his hedge fund and pulling back the curtain on some of his really kind of fringe anti-democratic views that he had, and also just not it kind of puncturing this notion that Silicon Valley is populated by just all these do-gooders who are creating these wonderful inventions. And the mainstream media at that point had, there are plenty of exceptions to this, but it was often engaging in kind of like oohing and eyeing at the latest marvels emerging from these Silicon Valley geniuses. And Gawker's mode of coverage was just much more skeptical and kind of antagonistic. And Peter Thiel did not like that. And he viewed that as a threat, not only to himself and his fortune, but also to kind of the rest of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. And so he set out to destroy Gawker in secret and hired a bunch of people that spent years looking for kind of legal vulnerabilities at Gawker, whether it was someone they had defamed or their treatment of employees or their hiring of interns, their tax payments, all sorts of stuff like that. And eventually, after a couple of years of scouting around for a promising vehicle to attack Gawker, Gawker published a snippet of a sex tape involving the wrestler Hulk Hogan. And Hogan was angry that Gawker had published the sex tape, which is understandable. And Peter Thiel, his a small army of lawyers and advisors, without anyone knowing that Peter Thiel was the one behind this, reached out to Hulk Hogan and helped him create a lawsuit that would be, it was designed to destroy Gawker. And this went on for a couple of years. And then in early 2016, a jury in Florida returned a huge verdict against Gawker and for Hulk Hogan that very quickly led to the demise of Gawker, which no longer exists today. And it only became clear after the fact that it was actually Peter Thiel who had orchestrated this behind the scenes. And I think, and I narrated this, I have a whole chapter in the book about this, and I think that's really, it's the first time that we've had the full story of what actually happened to Gawker. And the guy who Thiel had hired to do this, to kind of mastermind this effort, actually spoke on the record to me for the first time about this. And it's, I mean, it's kind of impressive, actually. Like they were really savvy and sophisticated about how they went about doing this. But it's also, I mean, and this was true at the time as well, it sent an extremely loud, like warning shot across the bow of news outlets and journalists, because it showed the power of a single rich guy to destroy what had been a very popular and successful website. And that is a scary signal to send if you are in the media, or if you're a reader of the media, or if you value having independent and fresh voices in the media. But to other people, like Donald Trump, this verdict was really inspiring. It showed him. I mean, in Trump, we've got like basically the audio of Trump right after this verdict is announced, talking to the Washington Post editorial board and just marveling at the success of this strategy. And Trump and Hulk Hogan have been friends for many years, and I think he was just like Trump was really overjoyed at this verdict, not just because he was happy for his buddy Hulk Hogan, but because it showcased the power of rich people like him, like Trump, to have their way with journalists or news outlets that are engaged in unflattering or unfavorable coverage.
Right. And the tactics that you described, you also bring to bear some anecdotes of the likes of Saudi sheiks and Russian oligarchs and billionaires like the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. This isn't one instance. This seems to be a trend.
Yeah, it's completely a trend. And I mean, you mentioned this earlier. This is not a brand new trend. This is something that has been happening on and off to varying degrees for decades. And what's new is that in the past decade or so, since, and really quite clearly since Donald Trump's rise to power, which happened to coincide with this Gawker verdict, which was a really big watershed moment as well. And these tactics have become much, much more prevalent. And they've been adopted by a much wider range of people almost in public. And it's very clearly designed, explicitly designed in some cases, to lead news outlets, journalists, and anyone else, including activists on the right and left, anyone who wants to have a loud voice in kind of public issues and public affairs. The goal, explicitly in some cases, is to cause people to censor themselves. and to not speak up loudly, to be much more careful when you're speaking about powerful people or institutions, and to because they want the threat of litigation to scare people. And I was just very surprised. Just last week, actually, there was a talk that a few lawyers gave at the Heritage Foundation where they literally said we want more self censorship. And so it's kind of out in the open at this point. And but I do not think it has received the attention and kind of notoriety that it deserves. And again, that was one of my goals in writing this book, was to make people aware that these are not little one-off circumstances. This is part of a much clearer, broader, and well-crafted plan that we're just kind of seeing the fruits of in the past few years.
Yeah, and again, like you had exemplified earlier, you're a humble guy, and you don't like the analogy of saying that just your work is something heroic. But from where I'm sitting, given the nature of what you've established with the First Amendment, the founding of our country because of a revolution against tyranny, and the whole purpose of the Fourth Estate, the truth is actually the only viable way this stuff can happen. And here you're introducing these methodologies of these people with immense resources that can utilize the situation to, in your words, weaponize libel laws to be able to intimidate and distract and really bury the truth, i.e., once again, to remind everybody, murder the truth, which is prolific in terms of just getting straight to the point. But there's a methodology to it. And there was a sort of a cottage industry, I guess, initially with legal, I should say, law firms that specialize this, but you go into detail about one in particular that's extremely important. Can you talk about Libby Locke and Tom Clare and Charles Harder?
Yeah, so Charles Harder is the kind of easier one to describe quickly and kind of dispense with. And he was one of the lawyers that Peter Thiel had hired to pursue Gawker. And when Gawker was destroyed at the hands of Peter Thiel and Charles Harder and some other lawyers, that really vaulted Harder to national prominence. And he very quickly signed up the Trump family as his clients, and on their behalf threatened everyone from like British tabloids to well-respected American book publishers and everyone in between. And took on clients like Harvey Weinstein and people like that. And so there's Harder. Harder is less of the center of this story, though, because he's actually, in my opinion, been less influential at kind of shifting the public debate over this stuff than Tom Clare and Libby Locke have been. And they are a husband and wife team that in 2014 set up their own law firm whose sole purpose was basically threatening and suing news outlets and journalists on behalf of clients that were almost always rich, powerful, famous, and very occasionally on behalf of kind of average Joe clients, but those were very much the exceptions that proved the rule. And they've brought and in some cases won quite a few cases. They have sent more threatening letters to journalists all over the country. And again, it ranges from people at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and to independent bloggers operating out of like their childhood homes who have the temerity and the misfortune to spend time like trying to do research on oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska. And they have, in addition to building a very successful business, making these threats and filing these lawsuits on behalf of their very wealthy clients, Libby Locke, in particular, has made it her mission to get the Supreme Court to overturn its decision from 1964 in New York Times versus Sullivan. And Locke, she's a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, a member of the Federalist Society, but it has, she's forged some powerful alliances with leaders of the conservative legal movement, and that includes judges. It includes Ron DeSantis in Florida, and her voice on this, and it includes people in the media or formerly in the media, like Tucker Carlson and Fox News. And she really developed, as a result of some of her legal victories and her outspoken advocacy, she really became kind of a national spokesman for this movement. And the movement has now, it has not succeeded yet, but it has picked up the support of at least two Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch. And that is not entirely the handiwork of Libby Locke and her allies, but it is certainly in part. They've very much brought this issue to the fore. And it is I feel like it's almost every week that we're seeing a new lawsuit that is filed by a powerful person, or more kind of movement by judges at the federal level, at the state level, to kind of incorporate what Libby Locke and her ilk have been saying now, at first quietly, but increasingly loudly over the past decade or so.
Right. And that also merged with a lot of very well funded think tanks and powerful interests, such as the Heritage Foundation and others that you
Yeah.
talked about with Charles Harder. But one thing that blew my mind, because I was kind of in the midst of this as it was going down, but you mentioned the Rolling Stone story. So at that time period, there was a whole sort of time period where Matt Taibbi was involved with these 10,000 word essays revealing all of the machinations of what Wall Street was involved with post the 2008 great financial crisis. And soon afterwards, they turned their attention to a story at the University of Virginia that relied on a on someone's testimony by the name of Jackie, which was kind of in behind the scenes. But that gave way to an opportunity for Libby Locke to exploit. Can you explain that situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, Rolling Stone published this just disaster of an article that was quickly and widely discredited. And it claimed that there was like a gang rape at the University of Virginia. There is no evidence that that occurred. Which would have been bad enough, except that as part of the article, the journalist, and it's not, just to be clear, it's not Matt Taibbi, it's another
Right.
journalist whose name I don't
I
even
didn't say it was
remember.
Matt Taibbi.
No,
Just
I know you didn't. I just want to just making clear for fairness to Taibbi. But the journalist had also pointed the finger not just at the people in the fraternity that had allowed this rape to happen, but also at a dean at UVA who had supposedly she was supposed to be in charge of policing against rapes and sexual violence, and according to the article, had not only looked the other way, but had kind of swept it under the rug. And again, the rape hadn't even happened, and the allegations about what the dean had done were quickly debunked, and I just do not think were true. But the dean's reputation was badly damaged as a result of this, and so Tom Clare and Libby Locke took on her case and sued Rolling Stone for defamation, and they won. And it was just days before the 2016 election. And look, I don't there are definitely times when the media screws up badly and deserves to get sued and deserves to be held accountable. We journalists are not immune and should not be immune from accountability and at times punishment when we destroy people's reputations for no reason. Like, and this to me, it is hard for me to find fault in bringing that lawsuit or in the jury ruling as it did, because it was a case of at best just real recklessness by Rolling Stone. And but in any case, the victory in that case against Rolling Stone, it was a really prominent case. The Rolling Stone debacle had received tons of attention, and so Libby Locke's victory in that really vaulted her into the national spotlight and made her someone that TV news shows would like call up when they wanted a talking head to discuss the issues of the day. And she became a fairly regular guest on Fox News, for example, where she was at least on a handful of occasions on Tucker Carlson's show, and used that very prominent spot to spread her argument that this wasn't that basically you needed to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan in order to be able to hold the media accountable. And I will just point out the irony there, which is that she was fresh off a victory in which she had held the media accountable on behalf of a client who was smeared. And she did so under the existing legal framework. So she did so with New York Times versus Sullivan in place. And so Locke's argument that she is now kind of refined into, I think, a very savvy and effective sales pitch is that the Supreme Court's First Amendment protections have essentially made it impossible to sue the media or hold the media accountable when it screws up and when they defame people. But Libby Locke's own experiences in court, her victories in court, disprove her entire thesis, because she has successfully done it like on numerous occasions, most notably with Rolling Stone. And so, the argument that the media needs to be held account, I don't disagree with that. And we in the media make mistakes. Some of those mistakes are bad, and we deserve to be held accountable when we do that, the same way anyone deserves to be held accountable when they harm someone else. And the question really is whether well, there's two questions. One is whether the existing legal framework is adequate to allow that accountability. And I think the answer clearly is yes. And even Exhibit A are Libby Luck's victories. And the other question is whether, even under the existing legal framework, people like Libby Locke and others are weaponizing the law to really take advantage of power imbalances that they have with deep pocketed clients who, for all intents and purposes, have infinite resources. And they're using them sometimes against places like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal that have lots of money, but much more often against independent journalists, local news organizations, or activists or advocates at the local level who just basically have no money, at least compared to the billionaires who they're going up against. And so they're seizing on this deep kind of asymmetry, and they're taking advantage, and it works really well because most rational people, journalists, companies, organizations do not want to stake their livelihoods or their future existence on having to prevail in a court, and so they back down, which is exactly what the Libby Locke and their clients want them to do.
Right. Well, again, to revisit the idea of deep-pocketed, profoundly powerful people, and again, to reassess why you got to read this book, my friends. Fear, the First Amendment, and the secret campaign to protect the powerful, which, of course, for anybody who's day to day on this stuff, I mean, it's hard not to want to bring in Vladimir Putin and influence with Trump at this stage of the game. But I'm not ready to go there because, more importantly, moving down doing the change to the local level is what I really want to get to. But before we do, can you reassess then, based on what you just said, again, just to remind the viewer, the nature of what is, I want to go into the specifics, basically of malice, because when you think of malice in context to defamation and reckless intent, can you square that triangle for me?
Well, the phrase "actual malice" is what the Supreme Court used in New York Times versus Sullivan to as kind of shorthand for that two-tiered standard that you need to prove if you're a public official or a public figure, you need to prove not only that you were defamed, but whoever did the defamation did so either lying or with reckless disregard for the truth. And so that, I mean, that's the standard. It doesn't, I think like a normal layperson hears the phrase "actual malice" and they think it means, like I would think it means, that you have ill intent, you want to harm someone, you're being malicious, and that's really not what it is. And in fact, it's a lower threshold than that because the plaintiff in a case does not need to prove. It's not a question of intent, it's a question of whether you were reckless or whether you were lying. And again, one other really important thing to recognize here is that this is the standard that applies to public figures and public officials. So, which, is a broad group of people, but it's always people who have power and influence in society or who are prominent figures. They've kind of injected themselves into a public debate or something like that. It does not apply to just normal person who posts something on or is like the recipient of an attack on Facebook. So if like you or I might not be a good example of this because I have injected myself into this public debate, but there's, if just random person who's listening to this gets defamed on social media or in their town newspaper or whatever, they do not need to prove that they do not need to hit this high threshold. They simply need to prove that whoever defamed them did so recklessly or not even recklessly, sorry, it's negligently. And so it's a much lower threshold. It's much easier to win those cases. This high bar that makes it harder to sue the media applies only to people with positions of various power or prominence. And so and again, this goes back to the Supreme Court's intent here, which is to protect against what we saw in Alabama 60 years ago, where powerful local officials were using these lawsuits they were just garbage lawsuits. Often these people were not even named in the offending pieces, but they were weaponizing the legal system to create a very powerful financial disincentive to news outlets covering the civil rights movement. And that, again, it's not the exact thing that we're seeing now, but it's very similar in that you've got powerful people at a national, state, and local level using these kind of garbage legal claims to just get people to shut up about them. And it has nothing to do with the merit of the legal claims or anything like that, because the mere act of making a threat or filing a lawsuit, even if that lawsuit is going to be tossed out of court at a relatively early stage, it can still very quickly cause whoever is on the receiving end of that lawsuit or that threat to rack up tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And like normal people cannot afford to do that. So, and again, that's by design. That is not an accident. That is a deliberate feature of these threats and these lawsuits.
Yeah, again, the complicity and the conspiracy of the powerful to hide that which they need to hide. So we've only got 15 minutes left, but I want to delve into probably the key consideration here. I'm going to go from the highest to just the regular, so to speak. But I'm not going to compound that question. I just want to specifically engage the idea of Clarence Thomas, because from the beginning, Clarence Thomas was in the midst of a giant controversy, of course, with Anita Hill at his confirmation hearings and all things, the innuendos and things that came out of it. But Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has had an entire mosaic of 30 years to to vector into a scenario based on his personal experience that in some ways it doesn't just cloud. I mean, he's in the midst of it, David, as those of us who have been
Yeah.
following everything that's going on. But can you speak to the nature of Clarence Thomas? And I guess the entry point would be the case of Catherine McKee versus Bill Cosby.
Yeah, I mean, I would set it up a tiny bit differently, which is that well, again, actually, it's the same. No, I would not set it up differently. I take that back. So yeah, in a case, I don't even think it's worth going into the specifics of the Kathy McKee versus Bill Cosby case. But in 2019, Clarence Thomas, there was a case that was appealed to the Supreme Court. Everyone on the Supreme Court, including Clarence Thomas, said we should not hear this case. But Clarence Thomas took the opportunity of rejecting this case to voice his disgust with and desire to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. And that his opinion in that case was it really it was in 2019, and it announced the arrival of this movement at the national stage. And for me, as I started on this project a few years ago, that was my entry point as well. And there Thomas's opinion in that case it struck me at the time, not knowing the backstory, as just kind of out of the blue. And so, and one of the things I did was just I tried to go back through Thomas's history to track his views on this matter. And started at basically at the beginning, which was his confirmation hearings in 1991, where, and most people don't remember this. I think I was like 12 years old at the time, so I definitely don't remember it. But I mean, there was two sets of confirmation hearings. One was pre Anita Hill, and the other was after Anita Hill's allegations became public. And at the end of his first round of hearings pre Anita Hill, he was asked about New York Times versus Sullivan and freedom of the press. And he gave, I think, a very candid and kind of measured response, but one that was very much endorsing New York Times versus Sullivan and the importance of having a free press, even when that those press freedoms and New York Times versus Sullivan mean that people like Clarence Thomas, and his wife, Ginny, who was sitting right behind him at the hearings, are kind of raked over the coals and in an uncomfortable position. And so he made those remarks, and which no one really picked up on it at the time. And then a few days later, Anita Hill went public with her allegations, and Thomas went through this, really heated process where that he found to be just incredibly destabilizing. And I narrate this in the book, but he was basically tipped over the psychological brink. I mean, he was like, curled up in the fetal position on the floor, wailing. And he felt like he felt that the media had demonized him and attacked him in this completely beyond the pale way. And look, I mean, I completely disagree with that assessment of what happened, but there's no question that that's how he felt. And you can then kind of trace through his public remarks and public writings over the ensuing decades how this hatred of the media and the idea that the media is out to get him and is trying to destroy him, that animated him in a lot of ways. And it shows up in his memoir in 2007, where he details numerous instances of the media supposedly trying to destroy him. And the interesting thing there is that I read the book and then was struck by all these supposed examples and went back and fact checked a few of them, and they're just not true. So he had, and I don't know if he's making things up or got confused in his head or what, but they're just not the things he is recounting as evidence of the media's vendetta against him, and the cause of his vendetta against the media is just, they are not grounded in facts. And I found that really interesting because it showed that this he'd really been consumed by this loathing of the media. But even then, that was in 2007. It wasn't for another 12 years that hatred, that anger that had been bottled up and festering for all these decades finally bubbled over. And it did so in this opinion that he issued against, or calling for the overturning of New York Times versus Sullivan. And then over the ensuing 6 years, he has over and over and over again renewed his calls, elaborated on his calls, intensified his calls for reining in the media, reining in the First Amendment. And Thomas, for all, he is a controversial person, but and a controversial lawyer who many people disagree with his opinions. But he also has enormous influence in the conservative legal movement. And so his advocacy on this topic completely changed us. And it immediately attracted the support of not only other federal judges, including Neil Gorsuch, other federal judges, other state judges, but the kind of entire machinery of the conservative legal movement leapt into action to support him. And that ranged from, groups like the Federalist Society and Claremont Institute and Heritage Foundation started to host discussions about this. Fox News started backing him up. And you had academics who were started to create research that was designed in part to kind of chip away at the foundations of Sullivan. And you had lawyers all over the country who were bringing cases that were designed to provide a vehicle for Clarence Thomas and his allies to finally fulfill this ambition of overturning Sullivan. So it really was a moment. It was a pivotal moment, and it's one that we're still very much, I think, feeling the effects of today.
Well, yeah, and pretty fresh, all things considered. When you realize Jenny Thomas, Heritage Foundation, Koch brothers, and then all the way through Harlan Crow and everything that ProPublica has revealed. But
Yeah.
it's another conversation for later. But this to me, I guess, because we're running out of time, but this is really the crux of the matter for somebody in my shoes, for example. Can you please talk about your story analysis based on the stuff that was happening in Colorado Springs with the Gazette and the revelations of intimidation, both from a developer, a powerful person on a local level, a real estate developer and city council and influence, based on kind of the matrix of what we're discussing, but also
Yeah.
if you can infuse the nature of the police department and their intimidation in the context of everything else?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, and we've talked about this a little bit already, and one of the things I really tried to do in the book was not have this centered on the experience of journalists like me who have, the backing of major institutions behind us. But I instead wanted to look at how this is kind of playing out on the ground. And to do that, I think it's really important for the public to understand a little bit better about how local journalism works and the care with which most local journalists pursue ambitious stories. So there's a chapter or two in the book where I detail these two kind of adjacent stories. One in Colorado Springs, where the local newspaper was writing about a real estate development that had some very serious design flaws, or there was concerns that it had very serious design flaws. And the journalist, whose name is Conrad Swanson, wrote a series for the local newspaper about this, and then began to get threats from lawyers representing the real estate development and representing some of the homeowners in that real estate development. And the real estate development firm hired lawyers that also happened to represent the owner of the newspaper, who is a billionaire conservative activist. And the newspaper, accounts kind of differ about the reasons the newspaper backed down, but the newspaper definitely backed down. They stopped aggressively covering this and writing about and investigating this real estate development. And the reporter who had been pursuing this left. And, in the weeks after he left, the newspaper and the real estate development actually struck up a partnership where they were kind of marketing each other's stuff. So to me, there was no lawsuit ever filed, but it was a very clear and deliberate effort by the real estate developers, not only to make scary legal threats, but to tap into this kind of overlapping network of lawyers that was also working for the newspaper's owner. So kind of incestuous. The thing with the local cops was a different newspaper, this one in Iowa, where a local reporter at the Carroll Times Herald in Iowa got a tip that there was a love triangle involving a local cop. He started investigating, immediately started getting threats. They eventually wrote the article. The cop sued them. And the facts in the article were completely true, but this years, well, months of litigation in this case before the lawsuit obviously got thrown out because the facts were true. It essentially bankrupted the family that had owned the newspaper and forced them to, they'd owned the newspaper for generations. They were like fixtures of the local community. They were committed to doing not just puff pieces about like local people around town, but also really interrogating the people in their community who held power, including the cops, who were very angry about this coverage. And a combination of the cost of the litigation and the fact that the local police basically organized a campaign to get people to cancel their subscriptions and pull their advertisements from the paper forced this family that had owned it for generations to sell to an out of town company that completely changed the newspaper's mission. And so it is no longer, I'm not saying the newspaper is bad now, but it's just a different focus, and it's no longer focused on accountability journalism or investigating local powerful people. It's focused on kind of features and much more kind of softer fare. And again, there's you can argue maybe that's not the worst thing in the world for the community, but there's no question that the police that had long kind of chafed at this newspaper's coverage because they were trying to hold them to account. They got what they wanted. And the newspaper is no longer seeking to hold them to account.
Well, I'll tell you, I wish, like I said at the outset, I wish we could go on for days, but you've got other more important interviews to do. But I really am deeply appreciative of your time. I wish we could go on to really the biggest sort of, I don't know, rug pull turnabout that I didn't expect from your book. And I'll leave this for the viewers to hopefully tantalize them to dive into this book full. But the nature of Claire Locke, i.e., Dominion, is another in the what you titled the crime of the century, is a giant sort of like, wow, all things considered, given everything that we've talked about. But we don't have time to go into it. I'm going to finish up with this. Guys, please do not, don't hesitate. Go get this book, David Enrich, Murder the Truth. And I'll put in the descriptions down below, obviously, Dark Towers and Servants of the Damned. And all the best to you. May the truth live, because given everything that we're in the midst of, Doge and billionaires and being able to use these tactics to intimidate, bully, and control, it's like a post-truth society in the United States that can't hold power to account. We're obviously not the United States. Do you have any kind of closing comments and hope forward that what the American people, as the sort of bulwark against tyranny, what we must think about in consideration of being able to absorb information that journalists like yourself have the ability to get out there?
I mean, it's simple. It's support journalism. Buy books, subscribe to your local newspaper, subscribe to the New York Times. Like, don't attack journalists for telling the truth, even if it's a truth you don't happen to agree with.
Because that goes both ways, because it does happen to the conservative as well, of course.
It does. It does.
Absolutely. All right, David, all the best to you, and continued success. And until next time,
Thank you.
all the best. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Patrick.